So to conclude, although I'm very, very concerned about what is possible, I don't know if we can do better by virtue of this facilitation in producing more adequate communicative exchange in a way that does have emancipatory consequences, both for the individuals involved and for the community of which they are part. For me, that's an open question. It is a hope. But we're actually going to look at it quite closely empirically to see if we are producing any result by all of these best practices that we are utilizing. And so to end, I can just briefly allude to my current kind of research effort. There is that empirical side to see, can we be involved in structuring deliberations in such a way that we can enhance the nature of the interaction in that setting, and therefore the kinds of individuals which are constructed in those settings. And finally, I have a theoretical interest of beginning to think of democracy in expressly pedagogical terms. That democracy isn't simply about decision making, but democracy is very much about creating democratic citizens. I have a colleague who just wrote a book on welfare systems, and he argued that the first responsibility of a democracy is to create the citizenry who can be appropriate democratic citizens. That is his first responsibility. Everything else comes second. And it's in this context that I pursue the research. Thank you.
I'm going to ask if you have some questions to you. Okay. Bueno, agradecemos al profesor y por supuesto está abierto a preguntas, cosas que quieran aclarar. Sí.
Just first a quick clarification to check if I was an active listener or not, because I don't know if I understood. The example that you gave on the higher education I'm trying to check if I understood. When you talked about the example of these 24 people who participated in this deliberation, the data showed that they were at the conventional level, but I heard you saying that they also ended up with some agreement on recommendations for the educational system. So I don't know if I missed some part in which you explained how they moved from a conventional discourse to sharing agreements and making share recommendations, or I missed something. I'm trying to understand what happened there in that transition from. And the second thing is, do you have other examples apart from this experiment that also confirm your hypothesis about the low quality of deliberation?
Okay, so the two questions. The first, and this will help me clarify, thank you for the question. The first is, I suggested that almost all of the conversation was conventional. And the problem seems to be, how did these people thinking conventionally come to agreement? And the reason is because they started off with a lot of shared assumptions. There are two ways in which they came to agreement. Is that they shared a lot of similar values to begin with. So all they had to do was identify those, and agreement became easy. That was one solution. The other solution, and this is a very American thing, and I think one of the things that is grossly underestimated in deliberative democratic theory is the power of different cultures of thought, of different cultures of communication. So Americans, it may surprise you a little bit, tend to be oppressively polite. And so what happens is that if someone is advocating particularly strongly, with some reason, there is a tendency not to engage the potential conflict, but to defer, create space so that is part of our agreement. even I don't really agree with that. So we found that one of the problems, which is typical of a conventional conversation, because of its presumptions of shared meaning and value and its way of regulating conversation, is that unless there's clear organized agreement at the outset, we are from two different groups. You know, I'm from union and you are from the bosses. Unless it is like that, a lot of real disagreement never gets addressed. And some of the creativity, potential creativity of the process is obstructed. With regard to other examples, I've looked at transcripts of other kinds of discussions that have taken place, a limited number. I work with a group based in Switzerland that used to, Marco Steenbergen and Jörg Steiner, who used to look at deliberation in parliamentary settings, but they are now interested in situations of high conflict. Places like the former Yugoslavia. And I've looked at some of their transcripts. Tali Mendelberg has been generous enough to share some of her manuscripts from me with work that was done with students at Princeton and at Brigham Young University. And then I've talked with, what has been particularly interesting for me is talking with activist organizers in the Los Angeles area. Again, a very diverse community. And what has been particularly interesting is some of the Latino organizers, many of whom recognize much of what I'm saying, as that makes sense to them. This is a problem they are regularly dealing with. What is interesting to me is some of the strategies whereby they believe they've been able to facilitate things in ways that are much more productive than what I found. So there's a lot for me to learn there.
¿Hay una pregunta por allá?
Thanks. No?
Ah, perdón, ella, disculpa.
See? Yes. I'm Lake Segueras. I'm with a citizens organization doing urban planning in Santiago. And we started fighting a highway project. And I found this really fascinating because, and what I would suggest to you is that you try doing the same process with a really diverse group. Because what happened was, we were 25 organizations from the markets, street vendors, my arts neighborhood, and an upper class neighborhood, but we were threatened by a highway project that was going to destroy us all. So the first element that led to really collaborative deliberation processes was interdependency, which is also something that Boer and Dins talk about in their theorization about planning. And, but the most important thing was, because we were all so different, we knew we didn't understand each other. And so the second component was time. The highway campaign took 3 years. And over the 3 years, the relationships that developed between us, sometimes, not all 25 organizations came to all meetings. And so sometimes we would have the flower vendors discussing or arguing or really getting into really deep differences with the upper middle class neighborhood, for example. And so there also was a recognition of the importance that our meetings were not only to discuss and make decisions about specific problems, but also to work out relationships. This was from 1997 to 2000. In 2000, the 25 organizations, we founded a new organization, Living City, which is now 10 years old, and there's a bunch of us here. And so the need for time and the need for permanent organizations and the need for diversity is, I find that the worst spaces to try and make transformative change happen is where everybody's the same. But if everybody, or there's enough difference that someone is challenging and saying, what do you mean, or I don't understand, or this doesn't work for me, or hey, I feel like you're pushing me in a direction I don't want to go, then you very quickly have to step beyond those conventions. And the final thing was that we realized that we couldn't just work things out in formal meetings, that we had to go out for a beer afterwards, that we had to organize an art auction, and everyone had to learn how to collaborate on a whole different, much more practical plane, or we had to go out and organize a march together, or fundraising, or whatever. And so organizing in informal spaces was as important as the formal spaces for real change to happen. And the kinds of trust and relationships that were built in that process have taken us through some of the most horrible challenges or crises or problems, and we're considered a pretty successful organization, although we usually question that, but other people seem to like to look at us and copy us for some things anyway. So, but I'm not saying that you should have done it the other way, because I think what's really interesting is looking at through homogeneous groups and through heterogeneous groups, and then you start really seeing some interesting contrasts.
Interesting, thank you. Estoy de acuerdo. First of all, with the issue of time, it's an interesting one, because clearly the more time one has, the greater possibilities there are. And so in that sense, you have a great advantage over what I have been working with. Although I should say that in the American context, these deliberative efforts are generally much more short-lived. They typically happen over a period of 6 to 10 months, involving maybe 4 to 12 meetings. And so it may be that this is simply too limited an activity to produce the kinds of democratic results one would like. With regard to difference, it is true that the big limitation of the group that I was working with is it was fairly homogeneous. The community draws a lot of Europeans, so there was a Belgian and a German and an Italian, but we can argue as to how really different they are, particularly given that they were all living and working in the US. The student deliberations that I'm working with now are perhaps more interesting in that regard, because they do come, although they are all Americans, they do come from very different ethnic groups and class backgrounds, and that might produce more interesting discussions. We're toward the end of that now, so I will know a lot more in 4 or 5 months. Also, this notion of what happens outside of deliberation. Because so much of deliberative theory was done by students of John Rawls or Jürgen Habermas, who, perhaps appropriately are referred to as old white men who worked at universities, the assumption was, they even weren't paying very close attention to their universities. The assumption was that some kind of mutual respect and sufficient motivation to listen to one another would emerge just in the conversational setting, which at least in my department, I don't know about yours, I wouldn't say that naturally occurs. And so this idea of extra deliberative activities as being central to the deliberation, I think, is quite important. And one of the things, somewhat artificially, we were doing with students is our university happens to have one of these setups that they use for corporate community building for corporations, where you take all the junior executives and you make them hang by ropes off of buildings that other people are holding so that they depend on one another. We've tried, we actually have access to that, so we've sent several of the groups to that. In the context of all of this, one particularly interesting conference on deliberative democracy that I went to, which could not